and continue. So we're here to consider the implications of the US election for Asia. And unless you've been hibernating in a cave over the past 2 days, you would know the surprisingly decisive outcome of the election. And after you hear from this panel, you may well want to return to the cave. In the meantime, you may be wondering what a second Trump administration means for Southeast Asia, for China, Japan, Korea, India, cross-strait relations, and Canada's relationships with those places. You might also be wondering about the implications for trade, security, and the climate crisis. Fortunately, to help us navigate these questions, we have a distinguished panel. And I will introduce them in a moment, but first a few words about the format. After I introduce the panelists by name and affiliation, I will invite them to say a few words about what each of them bring personally and professionally to the panel discussion. I've then asked each of the panelists to offer 2 or 3 high-level points telegraphing the issues that they will raise and focus on in our discussion. We will then turn to the moderated discussion itself, which will be structured around 4 sets of questions, which we shared with the panelists in advance. And we will then, towards the end of our hour and a half, open the floor to questions. So let me turn to our distinguished panel. I'm delighted to have with us on your left, Kai Ostwald, Professor of Political Science and Director of the Asia Research Institute at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. In the middle, we have Jia Wang, former Director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. We have on your right, Reeta Tremblay, Professor Emerita of Political Science at the University of Victoria. And joining us online, we have Veena Najibullah, the Vice President Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada in Vancouver. So with that, and as I move to take my chair at the front, let me invite the panelists to say a few words, no more than 1 or 2 minutes, about your background and about what you bring to the panel discussion.
Hi. Fantastic. Wonderful to meet everybody. I appreciate you braving the outside world and leaving the safety of the cave, if momentarily. My name is Kai Ostwald, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm trained as a political scientist, political economist. My work is on Southeast Asia. I've been based in Southeast Asia for quite a number of years before academia in the private sector. And I'm fortunate to have a position at the University of British Columbia that allows me to both engage disciplinary audiences, fellow academics, but also the world of practice beyond. So as you can imagine, there are few elections in the world that are more consequential to the political systems, the economies, the people of Southeast Asia, and this has occupied a large portion of attention in the region for the last couple of months, with now an awful lot of scrambling to figure out what's next on a number of key dimensions, from the economy to security to people ties, and more generally, how to make sense of Southeast Asia and the geopolitical world and rapidly evolving geopolitical world of that.
Yeah.
So pleased to be here. Thank you, Victor, and colleagues for organizing this event. And it's so wonderful to meet all of you here in person, and so those audience online. My name is Jia Wang. I'm currently the Senior Fellow and Senior Advisor for the University of Alberta, also a Senior Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I have been with the China Institute at UVic for almost 14 years, previously as the director and also the director for this institute. The institute mostly is policy research think tank focused exclusively. And prior to that, I have been a retailer, also a producer, focusing on covering news that is relevant to Canadian audience in Canada. Before that, I was born and raised in Beijing, China. So I've been a keen China observer from the inside and then on the outside for more than 30 years. I've spent maybe half of my life in China and half here. And of course, the US election is quite a consequential one. And so we all know the relationship between the US and China. Some call it perhaps one of the most important bilateral relations in the world. And hoping to just share more thoughts on that.
If everyone could speak up as loudly as they can, just.
My name is Reeta Tremblay. I hope this is loud enough.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
good.
good. And as Victor said, I'm retired from from the university, but I'm a political scientist, and for about 30 years I did some senior academic administrative jobs in a few universities, including being a provost here. And despite that, I did keep my hand in the research portfolio. My research fundamentally is on actually comparative politics and domestic politics of India, secessionist movements, multicultural federalism, etc. But Victor's question, what each one of us brings here, in 2016, I did take a bold step with my co-author, Ashok Kapoor, and wrote the first book called Modi's Foreign Policy. And in that book, we basically suggested that there is a paradigmatic shift in Indian foreign policy from the traditional non-alignment to what we call the multi-level alignment. So we are happy to note that that policy doctrine has become really fundamental to the Modi government. It's known by different names, by some call it multi-alignment, some call it strategic autonomy, some call it India's external affairs minister a few days ago in Australia called it multi-vector foreign policy. Nobody knows what to say about it, but it's a big. But we also suggested some constraints on this foreign policy. Unfortunately, our predictions did not come out. Our predictions. Sorry. So our predictions did not come out true. We said that if Modi's foreign policy or doctrine is not going to succeed, it's going to be because of two things. One is his anti-Muslim rhetoric, particularly with regard to the state of Jammu and Kashmir and his Hindutva stuff. So we know that that has gone deeper and deeper in Modi's government. So that's unfortunate, but the doctrine does stay. For past, I've been also dabble in India-Canada relations, and past year has been in busy year. So that's what I bring to the table.
Thanks, Rita. And over to you, Veena, online, coming to us from Vancouver.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Victor, and to Cappy for organizing this and for allowing me to participate virtually. I hope you
Sorry,
can hear
Veena,
me.
we're just,
Yeah.
Could you hold on a second? We need to switch the audio.
Okay, I will wait.
Veena, can you go ahead?
Yeah, there's an echo on your side, but I'm happy to start again. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Victor and Cappy, for the invitation to be with all of you, and apologies for not being there in person, but I'm really looking forward to this discussion and to adding as much as I can through this virtual format. I'm Veena Najibullah. I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. I have a unique privilege of leading and working with a team of about 25 researchers who are looking at Canada's relationship with the entirety of the Indo-Pacific region, so Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia. And so happy to contribute from that perspective. But also personally, I've been really interested in looking at the emerging US security alliances and structure in the region, particularly what has been happening with Japan, South Korea, as well as Philippines, and obviously the situation in the Taiwan Strait. I also look at Canada-India relations, and we'll be happy to add to that as well. But very much look forward to the discussion with a clear caveat that, of course, a lot of this is still speculative. We have heard what President-elect Trump has said on the campaign trail, and he's made lots of claims and promises. Of course, much will depend on what the personnel is around him, what kind of policies actually make it out of the gate in the first 100 days or so. But of course, there is quite a bit of worry out there among key US allies in particular. I think Asia is a big place, but we can easily divide it into sort of two categories: those who are US allies, particularly security allies, and they're quite worried. And then those who are not. Countries like India feel very much like they can navigate whatever comes. And in fact, some feel that this may be actually good news. Sorry, there's a bit of...
Ibu namanya siapa, Bu? Siapa? Oh, Retno.
I think, there we go. Sorry, that was something else. I think India calling. But anyways, I will stop there, Victor, but very much hoping to engage in the discussion as you lead it. Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks for those introductions. I mean, it's clear we have a lot of expertise on this panel. Our next order of business is I'd like to invite the four of you to highlight maybe 2 or 3 points, high-level points. I remember when I was working at a law firm and I was preparing legal research memoranda, they said, put your conclusion up front. So what are those 2 or 3 highlight points that you'd like to everyone to think about before we go deeper into the discussion? So over to you, Kai.
Great, thanks. I'm going to, again, speak from the perspective of some Southeast Asian interests, Southeast Asia's interests. And I think despite the region being incredibly diverse, one commonality across almost all of the countries is the prioritization of development. Jokowi, Indonesia's now former president, put it very well when asked what are Indonesia's top priorities, that we have 3: development, development, and development. Given that, of course, Trump's talk on tariff and America first and the general expectations of a more protectionist approach to the economy are deeply concerning across Southeast Asia. And that's especially true for countries that have substantial bilateral trade imbalances. That's Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. They are deeply exposed to potential tariffs from Trump. 20% was the suggestion as a baseline. That has a lot of implications for how Southeast Asia navigates the world and who it turns to as a reliable partner. The second is the issue of the reliability of the rules-based international order, specifically as a security assurance. There has been a subtext over the last decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, that if a country in Southeast Asia generally plays by the rules, there is a degree of protection involved in that as well. And what I think we've observed over the last year plus, as came out very clearly in, for example, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies State of the Region survey last year, is that there is growing skepticism about how universally the rules-based order is applied. And specifically when it's in the interests of some Western countries, it is matters. When it's not, the rules-based order is disregarded. I think Trump adds additional reason for skepticism about the reliability of the rules-based international order. Of course, he's expressed extensive skepticism for general frameworks of that kind in the past, and there is a sense that that his very capricious and personalistic and transactional manner of approaching politics means that there are fewer reliable reference points, and it is a bit more of a free-for-all in formulating foreign policy for Southeast Asian countries. That said, that may not be necessarily only a costly proposition. Several Southeast Asian countries will see opportunity in working with a leader like Trump in the hopes that they're able to strike effective bargains with him that bypass some of the more sensitive issues, for example, labor rights, democratization, gender, any number of other things, environmental protection standards as well. And maybe finally, I think it's also important to note that the general preference across Southeast Asia is for an inclusive Indo-Pacific. And by inclusive from the Southeast Asian perspective, that means inclusive of China as well. That means there is a lot of concern about a lot of Trump's rhetoric around containing China and generally taking a more assertive stance in confronting an equally assertive China. So I'll leave it at those three to begin with. Those, I think, are some of the highlights of what Southeast Asia sees in the election.
Thanks, Kai, and we'll get deeper into those points in a few minutes. So, yeah, over to you.
So talking about preference, Kai was mentioning preference of Southeast Asian countries. People, of course, before Trump is confirmed elected, are wondering whether China would prefer a Harris or a Trump administration. Which one would China rather work with? The answer is neither. The Chinese leaders are very aware of this bipartisan tough on China approach that is unlikely to change no matter who is going to be in the White House. And now, of course, the answer is Trump is going to be in the White House. The Chinese leaders have been preparing for continued tension with the US, difficulties. They are a bit more concerned or anxious about a Trump second term because, of course, of its erratic style and the volatility it's likely, it is likely he is going to bring to the table. So the US and China relationship over the past few years have been bumpy, but in the last year, it has been largely stabilized under Biden administration, and China would prefer to extend this period of stability as China currently is facing huge challenges in its economy. It really tried to focus primarily on reigniting its faltering economy. So a highly volatile, unstable relationship is not something China desires. And despite China often being branded as a revisionist power, China benefited from probably one of the most among all the big economies through the existing world order and existing trade system. And China would rather not to see disruption it perceived from Trump that could potentially harm China's economy even further. In the long run, however, many in China see a second term under Trump administration will accelerate the decline of the United States by destabilizing the American politics internally, but also diminishing Americans' global influence. Quickening of this shift, the shift of the US-China power dynamic to help pivot towards more in China's favor. So that's many Chinese believe that a Trump administration in the long run could be good for China. And that's why many Chinese or some Chinese netizens nicknamed Mr. Trump, Trump the country builder. And this country he is helping to build is not the United States, it's China. He's doing it by diminishing US power and also diminishing US allies. So in the past couple of months, as it leads up to the US election, most of the Chinese media have been focusing on the chaos, the divisiveness of the American society, and how complicated this American electoral system is and how messy it is. And it's really trying to, or at least attempting to highlight how dysfunctional the American democracy is. And perhaps not surprisingly, we see, according to recent survey, over 80% of the Chinese population actually hold negative views of the US government and also the US policies. And that number is matched by how many Americans holding negative views of China. And this type of negativity on both sides would likely to sustain a rather challenging relationship, no matter who is in the White House. And of course, under Trump, there are more unpredictability. And but when it comes to Trump's approach, again, it's purely speculative, and we don't know exactly how Trump is going to go about its China relationship. But if we look at the person he's likely to select as his top 8 in foreign policy and their perspectives, we sense that this framing of China as a threat is going to continue, and perhaps it's going to become more negative as some of these potential picks to lead the policy, the foreign policy portfolio in the US frequently refer to China as an existential threat to the US. And also they would disagree with the current administration's approach to manage this relationship with China. They want this zero-sum rivalry with China to be won by the US. And what does it mean to win that rivalry is they would like to see ultimately a regime change in China. And that's very hard to achieve. And that's also quite alarming for the Chinese Communist Party. Under the current administration, the view is, okay, we're going to compete and also cooperate when we can, but also confront China. But the current administration recognize the need to peacefully coexist with China, even when China is still under CCP or Chinese Communist Party rule. But that view might be shifting as the new extremely or seriously hardline China hawks are brought into the cabinet to help set Trump's foreign policy. And but there is a wild card, of course, in this is Mr. Trump himself. And for better for worse, he's not actually following necessarily ideology when it comes to foreign policy. And he's, as we all know, acting highly on impulse and transactional kind of decision making. And that potentially opens doors for Beijing to play the game of engage in direct negotiation with Trump and perhaps offer some symbolic wins and then to really get what China may want. So there is on both sides, there will be some assessment of this relationship and putting a path forward. And the first point of friction, though, of these two great powers of these two largest economies will be on trade. As Trump repeatedly said, he's going to slap 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. That's on top of the tariffs American already implemented during the first Trump term. So that is really causing a lot of concern in China. Right after Trump got elected, the Chinese yuan, the value was down, and also the Chinese stock market was down. So there's a deep concern about deepening of a real effort to decouple the two economies. And for the Chinese business and also for the Chinese state, there's even a more concerning point on trade is US is or might be revoking Chinese sort of, it used to be called the most favorite nation status, and that will entrench the higher tariffs more systematically. So China is quite concerned about that. And then, of course, China is doing what it can to try to build resilience in its economy, but also try to reach out to friends in, or hopefully friends in Asia, but also around the world, and trying to increase its space and sphere of influence, hopefully to use that to offset this potential a period of more frictions and more conflicts with the US.
Great, thank you.
Just
Reeta.
shifting to India, I thought I'd start by telling you that how this news of Trump's election was received in India. So Mr. Modi was one of the first world leaders to post a message on X, and then it was followed by an early morning conversation yesterday with Mr. Trump, where Mr. Modi called Mr. Trump my dear friend and said that this was a historical and spectacular win for him. And Mr. Trump, in response, of course, praised Mr. Modi and called him a magnificent man. India is a magnificent country, and the whole world loves Mr. Modi. So that was the context. So they do have a personal rapport. There's a mutual admiration, personal rapport between two very strong leaders, but it comes with a political context within which we should look what's going to happen to in those US relations. over the last 3 decades, despite whichever party is in power, whether Republican or Democrat, the relationship between the two countries have deepened, and some call it entrenched, some call it resilient. So, and of course, China is the issue which binds the two together. India and the United States have always big trading partners. US is India's largest trading partner, about $120 billion trade. US is now the leading investor in India, about $52 billion. And Indian companies have invested in the United States about approximately $47 billion. So within this context, there's a general perception in India that the strategic partnership between the two countries will continue during the second term, and China is the factor. However, I'm going to speculate also that I anticipate potentially some areas of trouble and some areas of opportunities for India. And I've put them in 4 different categories. One is India's domestic politics and democratic backsliding. Second is Russia and Russia-Ukraine war. These 2, I will tell you, will give opportunities to Mr. Modi to do whatever he wants. And trade and immigration are the trouble points. So let me take one by one. So people like us who love democracy and cherish democracy, for Mr. Modi, Trump's victory is a plus point. And the Trump presidency will give a pass to the Modi government on the issue of democratic backsliding, thus emboldening Modi's authoritarian tendency and his Hindutva agenda. We got some sort of flavor during the campaign because Trump singled out Hindu American diaspora. Okay, so just give you a little context, there are about 5 million Indo-Americans in the United States, and 48% are Hindus. Okay, 8% Sikhs, but 48% Hindus. So he promised them, he said, I am going to protect Hindu Americans against the anti-religion agenda of the radical left. And he criticized Biden-Harris administration. He says, they haven't protected you. They haven't protected you either in the country or in the world, and where he was referring to the news hopefully you've been following with regard to Hindus in Bangladesh. But Trump is very cognizant of the fact that his personal rapport with Modi has led to some political dividends for him, because for the first time in the United States, you're beginning to see that Indo-Americans are beginning to vote for the Republican Party. They generally have voted for Democrats, and now there's a shift in the Republican Party. In this regime, we are not going to see Trump basically providing any support for Khalistani groups, or not going to do any intervention with regard to Modi's anti-Muslim rhetoric. So this is a plus point for Mr. Modi. The second plus point is with regard to Russia and Russia-Ukraine war. And so in this one, I think India is going to come out a winner also with regard to the pursuance of what I talked about in my introduction, the multi-alignment strategic autonomy policy, because it has used that doctrine to justify why it has avoided taking sides with regard to Russia-Ukraine war. It is declared, is openly talked about Russia is the oldest friend. Buying cheap oil from Russia. Russia is also India's largest arms supplier. Despite, there's been a little bit of diversification now it's buying weapons from France, Australia, Israel, other places. But it has used that policy in order to justify itself. Now, you might ask me, what is this multi-alignment policy? Multi-alignment policy fundamentally doctrine is that India will pursue its national interests with diverse actors who have diverse interests without necessarily aligning itself with any single power. Okay, so it wants to have its cake and eat it too. And so Modi government had hard time convincing the Biden administration and the Western allies, but they hesitantly have agreed to India's stance. Now, given Trump's skepticism about continued aid to Ukraine and his campaign that he's going to end the war, it is really, India does not have to worry about its relationship with Russia. So it feels its speed. So these are two opportunity points for India and the Modi government. However, where we're going to see trouble or friction is in the fields of trade and immigration. With Trump, everybody's talking about Trump imposing his tariffs. India cannot forget what happened during the first term. During the first term, the tariffs on steel and aluminum were imposed, India went into a retaliatory mode and it imposed its own tariffs, okay, on digital services, on agricultural goods. Trump also ended in 2019 the preferential trade agreement with India. And so India hasn't forgotten that one. So now during 2024 campaign, Trump openly has said India is a big abuser. And although he added the word, Modi is a good friend. And so, but his pledge is basically to go into tariffs. And if that happens, India is going to find its engagement in a little bit trouble. But on the other hand, India is also hoping, I mean, if you read the Indian newspaper, is hoping that Trump will only go after China. And if it goes after China, then it will take advantage of the US's doctrine of de-risking, decoupling, and India will be the friendly supply chain provider. Now, with regard to immigration, there are two aspects which India has to deal with. One is illegal migration of the Indians into the United States, and the other one is the legal skilled migration. In recent years, the United States has seen an unprecedented surge of undocumented Indians coming into the United States. First, they were coming from Mexico. Now they're coming through Canada. And I can tell you that there are 725,000 undocumented Indians in the United States, and it's the third largest group. Okay, in terms of percentage, it's not that much because Mexico is the biggest one. And so Biden and Modi have been agreed to kind of deport Indians back to India. And I think this past year, about 1,000 or so undocumented Indians were sent back to India. So Trump will continue that, and hopefully, probably might not be restrained, but push that to a lot. But it's the legal migration which India is very worried about it, because Trump wanted to have a restriction on skilled migration, which is basically the IT workers, and he had imposed what is called the H-1B visa restrictions, reducing the number of the IT people in the United States. So India is worried about it, what's going to happen. And if this happens again, it's going to force Indian companies to look at other places, and that would reduce the technological cooperation with the US. So I'm going to just stop here and say short, is basically, these are some anticipated perils and opportunities, but we know that Trump is unpredictable. So it's all about wait and see. So we'll see what happens.
Thanks so much, Reeta. Veena, over to you for a couple of high-level points.
Sure. The advantage or disadvantage of going last is that everything has been said, but let me try to add a couple of points to the discussion. I think at the high level, Trump's election and him as a president for the next 4 years will accelerate a shift towards a more multipolar and a more contested world. We're already seeing that. Kai alluded to this as well, that there will be greater pressures on the rules-based order. Whatever parts of the system were still functioning will come under greater pressure because of a more isolationist, because of a more protectionist and unpredictable and unreliable United States, and a president that will prioritize personal relationships, favors, likes and dislikes over alliances, over rules, over bodies like NATO or Quad or any of the other things that have come to guide US engagement in the world over the last 4 years, but also arguably for the last 70 years. So to the extent that we were seeing that shift already, I think the Trump presidency is just going to accelerate that. On kind of a couple of points that have been mentioned with respect to China, I think I agree with Jad that long-term, China sees a more isolationist, a more America first kind of policies of Trump to be advantageous to it. Because while there is bipartisan consensus in the US about strategic competition with China, about sort of the overall direction of travel, the Biden administration, probably the greatest thing that it did, and the thing that probably bothered China the most, was the partnerships and alliances with Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, even Philippines. And that was putting pressure, and that's long-term strategically not to the benefit of China. And I think President Trump will likely undermine many of those, or at least that's, again, it's speculative. It depends on who are some of the people, what are some of the dynamics, but the likelihood that there will be concerted engagement with allies, both in the Indo-Pacific and within NATO and in Europe, I think is very small. So we will see a lot of tensions in that regard. Of course, when it comes to China, kind of three big buckets are trade, technology, and Taiwan. On trade, I think we all have heard what President Trump wants to see happen. And I think some of the people that will end up in the administration that we already know, like Bob Lighthizer, Peter Navarro, they will most likely sort of make good on those promises. So we'll likely see another kind of trade war coming in. Technology, I think, is a more interesting area where the Biden administration, again, went in a very methodical way of bringing allies like Netherlands, Japan, South Korea on board with the various restrictions that were put in place on technology, particularly critical and emerging technology sales to China. Whether or not that will continue under Trump is a little bit less of a known quantity, in part because of a new factor, which I think just entered the picture in the last few months, which is Elon Musk. And what sort of this newfound, well, as President-elect Trump said, a star has risen, and he was speaking about Elon and SpaceX and all of that. And of course, we know that Elon Musk has deep economic relations, both in China, but also in other places. So to what extent that will play in, to me, is an interesting new factor that we haven't fully appreciated. And on Taiwan, I think the only thing I'll add is that people on Taiwan are worried, in part because, if nothing else, President Trump's view of the island has always been very much kind of as a bargaining chip, like something that he can leverage in his relationship bilaterally with China, rather than as a place which is inhabited by 24 million people, self-governing and democratic society. So it was never from a place of what's good for Taiwan. It's much more kind of a Taiwan as another lever. So, and I think that does certainly worry people. Although under the first Trump administration, there were a number of people in the National Security Council and other key posts within the government that actually understood what was at stake and ended up prosecuting policies that ultimately I think were on balance still okay for Taiwan. Whereas in the second Trump administration, we're not sure who will be those people actually implementing day-to-day the policies. And that's a big question mark. On India, I'll add one point, which is I completely agree with everything Reeta said. And one element of it, which is really relevant for Canada, is that the fact that President of the United States is likely to deprioritize issues of human rights, rule of law, transnational repression will have implications for Canada as well, because we have taken a very strong public principled stand on this issue. We can sort of argue its merits, but that's where we are. And I think there was a certain feeling in Ottawa that Washington was going to have our back, at least that privately Washington was going to lean on India for some sort of cooperation on this in the medium to long term. I think now that's completely out of the question. And so the bigger issue now for Ottawa is going to be, how do we manage this very public rapture in our diplomatic relations without the private backing of our key ally, which now we have in the Biden-Harris administration. So I think that's going to be a serious thing for Canada to manage. I think the interesting thing in Northeast Asia is going to be to what extent Japan and South Korea in particular are able to sustain the rapprochement that had been achieved with a lot of bridging and support of the Biden administration. The trilateral between US, Japan, and South Korea was really a big, again, a feature of an achievement of the Biden administration. Whether that will continue without that kind of smart statecraft and diplomacy on the part of the US, I think, is a question mark. Obviously, there are domestic pressures in both Japan and South Korea that will play into this. Japan, as you know, is going through its own political transition. We're much weakened. Even if Prime Minister Shiba holds on to power, he'll be much weakened. There's a lot of also pressures in South Korea as well. And of course, the new dynamic of the North Korean involvement in the Ukraine war and a deeper North Korea-Russia security partnership that's changing the calculus for South Korea. So all of that, I think, is in play. And without a clear US engagement, unclear where things will end up. I mean, there are many other things to say, particularly for kind of what all of this also means for Canada's policies in Asia, because we'll see, obviously, US changes both in terms of economic policies, which everybody fully understand, but also potentially security posture in the region. That will have implications for how Canada also continues to engage with the region through its own Indo-Pacific strategy. I'll stop there in the interest of time, but happy to answer any questions.
Setting out some of the really big and complicated issues. We're going to shift now to a moderated discussion, and we have 4 buckets of questions. One around perceptions of the United States from Asia, a second around foreign policy, a third around the domestic political implications, and then a fourth around implications for Canada's relationship with Asia. So I want to sort of take those one at a time. I'd like to invite the panelists to, this is your opportunity to interact and react to one another's comments. But that first set of questions, and many of you have already addressed this, but maybe we can go a little bit deeper, and if there are disagreements among the panelists. I'm curious about how the US election has been perceived in the countries that you're familiar with. Some of you have talked about that already. What does the election and its aftermath mean for the US standing in the region? And Jia, you talked about, well, I'm putting words in your mouth, but the Make China Great Again campaign. And how does, more generally, how does the US election affect the standing of the West and US influence in Asia more generally? So please, I'd invite you to come in on any of these questions. Notionally, I guess we could start with Kai, but if anyone else wants to jump in first, please do.
Sure. Well, let me just say, the first Trump administration was disconcerting to the US. There is a general narrative with lots of truth and some detail disregarded, that the post-World War II order was one in which the US provided security guarantees to Southeast Asia in exchange for market access and the like. And that was premised on the notion of that security guarantee. There's a lot of concern across Southeast Asia of wavering US commitment to that. The first Trump administration certainly shook that commitment quite deeply. Southeast Asian states will frequently express varying forms of hedging strategies where they essentially seek to diversify their connections, both in terms of, especially economic, and avoid being pulled too tightly into the grip of any major superpower, global power, the United States or China, right? I think from the perspective of many leaders in Southeast Asia, one election of a leader like Trump might be an aberration. A second election looks like a pattern, right? And that this says something about the longer term role of the United States in global politics, and calls for a very serious strategic reconsideration of how it navigates geopolitical risk. I think the fundamental US Southeast Asian position of not wanting to pick sides in any great power struggle, any great power tension remains, right? But the more there are questions about the reliability of the US and the capriciousness of leadership in the US and the propensity for guarantees to be abandoned, the more I think Southeast Asian states
think about other minilateral alignments, think about other security arrangements, think about other economic partnerships, and you know, China is always a willing partner in those as well.
Does anyone want to react or respond to Kai? Reeta?
First, I think with regard to perception, it was a very interesting election to watch in India, because there was a huge interest, but everybody was saying, we don't care what the outcome is. And even, you know, from the external ministry and the external minister, his viewpoint was, we will work with whether it's he or is she. I mean, now what is coming out is that they are more in favor of Trump rather than Harris. But at that time, the perception was very much there, and that has to do with bipartisan. But I want to react something to what you said. It's a very interesting point what you bring about, that the Southeast Asia sees itself as an inclusive, does not want to take sides. That's where India finds an opportunity, and it's been talking about multipolar Asia. And multipolar Asia is very, very important. It's not only doing the doctrine of multi-alignment or multi-level alignment, but it wants to have a new set of global governance. It's talking about inclusive, equitable Asia, small powers, major powers who will work together and will come up with a new governance structure. But within that is hidden a message to China. We want China to be less India pushed to China's side, and India can create this kind of alliance. So what I think is the second Trump administration is going to create that little space for India, not only pursue its strategic autonomy, multi-alignment, but also push the multipolar Asia.
Veena, I saw you wanted to come in.
Sure. Yeah, just quickly, 2 points. One, on the reputation, I think we have to acknowledge that U.S. reputation do you want me to stop? I can't hear you anymore.
You can go ahead now.
Sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to come in on 2 points, if I could. One is on the issue of reputation and perceptions of the US. I think we have to acknowledge that outside of the global West and the kind of global majority, global South, US reputation was already in a difficult place because of Gaza. And I think that especially in Southeast Asia and Africa and Latin America and places even like Brazil, you wouldn't think about it automatically, but Gaza was a really kind of a turning point when it came to belief in the US or a rules-based order, or sort of this US-led order that has existed for 70 years. And I think, again, Trump will accelerate that decline further. With respect to reactions, I think for countries that like India or like Indonesia or Vietnam that had a multi-vector foreign policy, sort of hedging structures or strategies of all sorts, they can navigate this much easier than countries that are treaty allies of the US and sort of in some sense had taken a side. So, and including countries like the Philippines, which more recently chose to take a side and are now probably much more vulnerable and are feeling much more anxious. So Japan, South Korea, Australia, and like I said, the Philippines, Taiwan, those are places which in the last certainly 5 years, were actually very much seen is in the US camp and balancing and deterring against China, Russia, and others. So for those countries, I think now the big question mark is, can they sustain some of those collective minilaterals or alliances without US leadership? Is there enough momentum among the middle powers to sustain that? Or are things going to become much more sort of, if it's America first, then it's Europe first, it's Japan first. Like, is it going to be a race to the bottom, or actually others will come together and kind of unite around a common cause?
On the perception side, I already spoke a little bit about it in my opening remark. In China, according to some recent surveys, of course, the Chinese are really seeing China, US still as the most influential country, consequential country in the world, but China is, just a close second. And they also see the power of China is rising and the power of the US and by extension, the West is declining. So that there is that dynamic the Chinese population seems to see, and they think, of course, Trump is likely going to accelerate that the U.S. decline, so that will give more space for China. But interestingly, also how the world see this U.S.-China power dynamic, and during the first Trump presidency, surprisingly, actually, the world view Trump and Xi, or the leaderships in the U.S. and in China, equally unfavorably. So they're both at a pretty low level up there. They're quite comparable. And then when Biden came into power, that view of the US has improved, and the view of China pretty much remained. And now the second Trump presidency, we'll see what's happened there. And also when the ASEAN countries are recently asked to, if they have a preference when it comes to US and China, which one, if they're pushed to choose a side to align with, this 2023 to 2024 number shows that actually more ASEAN countries are preferred to align with China. I mean, of course, there's a couple of exceptions, and notably Vietnam, the Philippines, and Singapore, but more, quite a few ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, one of the most populous, and Malaysia, they are choosing the side of China. So that dynamic is also changing. And of course, after Trump comes into office, we'll see if that's going to shift further.
Do you want to come in on that point about ASEAN and perceptions of the US and ASEAN?
Well, I think it's a very good point that the shine came off the United States quite some time ago, right? And that a lot of the concerns about the reliability of the United States as a partner, these far predate Trump. They predate Trump, number one. I think it underscores a key point that you alluded to. From the Canadian lens, from the gaze of North America across the Indo-Pacific, across the Pacific, we assume that the way the United States projects itself is likely received by countries in the Indo-Pacific, and I think that's largely not been true, right? We can say a lot about the IC survey and how reliable that is, but and again, the question itself is a bit flawed in that the overwhelming priority, the overwhelming preference of countries in Southeast Asia is precisely not to choose between the two. But the broader point is correct, and this is a hastening of those concerns.
Just add a little bit here, even India's attitude have changed, is beginning to change with regard to China. It just happened recently. And with regard to the border stuff going on since 2020, India and China were basically virtually not talking. I mean, they were talking, but they were not really agreeing on anything. And it's only last month and a half that they came up with the agreement of what they call it, disengagement on the border, which means that we are not going to throw a weapon, we're not going to have a fist fight or anything, but we'll allow people to patrol it. So I think India was beginning to kind of anticipate what will happen in this election and try to kind of mend fences with China, but China also wants to do so, and they've agreed to move on. So far as India is concerned, I mean, United States has been really counting on it that it's a countervailing power, but it doesn't understand India that it will not choose sides. And if it has one of the, yes, U.S. trade was largest trading partner for the last 2 years. China was that this year, China is the largest trading partner, and huge trade, deficit with regard to India has a huge trade deficit. But it is not going to alienate China also. So China is very important for India, and also with regard to its own neighborhood. It wants to make sure that China does not keep on, spreading its wings around there. So this multipolarity, India somehow is, developing that doctrine, but I think it's going to push with China is as important. But very importantly, in multipolar Asia, they're also saying United States is not excluded. US can be a part of it. We don't want people to be excluded, although this is about multipolarity, new governance structure, but we welcome the US partnership. So I don't know how this game is going to get played out, but it's an interesting one.
So I'm going to invite us to shift into the second bucket of questions, which I think this leads naturally into, which is about foreign policy. And if I could just add a quick follow-up and sort of focus us a little bit on foreign policy. So I wonder about BRICS, right? The Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa grouping. I know there were some recent meetings. What you seem to be suggesting, Rita, is that there may be an opportunity for the two most populous countries in the world, right, to get a little closer. I mean, it's really remarkable how difficult it is to get from India to China by plane, right? You can't. There are very few, flights, and there's
a kind of still strategic stuff going on, so as India is concerned.
Right.
So BRICS has now been expanded. Iran is, for example, included. Yeah. India is also a member of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation, participates with China in that one. But India is also seeing that by its expansion of BRICS, how this can also lead to the diminishing role of China. So it's not basic. India wants to see itself as a dominant power. And so it really is coming, it basically wants to make sure, for example, BRICS, its relationship with Russia, why it wants to have stronger relationship with Russia, because it wants to make sure that there is no Russia-China alliance. And so to prevent that, it wants to make that, and that's how it convinced the United States and allies that why it wants to maintain the friendship with Russia. So although the notion is strategic autonomy, but the idea here is keep China in its proper place, but let's see, but on the other hand, we are not going to align ourselves. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Does anyone else want to come in on this part of the question? Veena? Give us one. Switch the audio.
Okay, I think I can't hear you now, but I hope you can hear me. Sorry, just a very quick point on the China-India. I agree with Rita that it's good to see the disengagement on the border, but I think the overall strategic competition between China and India will persist. So we're not going to see a reset anytime soon, and what's happened in the US won't impact that. I mean, that the overall competitive nature of the relationship, the mistrust will continue. So when you look at the BRICS, I think it's important to note that, yes, there are some things that unite the group, usually the opposition to a Western-led order or a desire to reform that order, but there's also a lot of differences within the group as well. And while some, like, Russia, arguably China, can be positioned as anti-West, India, Brazil are not in that camp. If it enlarges and Indonesia and others come in, it's important for folks in Canada, and I think in the West in general, not to see the BRICS as an anti-West grouping. The depth of convergence among the members is fairly thin. There are some issues on which they agree, which is more inclusive global governance institutions. Brazil is the head of the G20 this year, has really made that a priority. So I think there are some things on which those countries agree, but the level of distrust and disagreement among them cannot be underestimated. I think sometimes it's a shorthand that we use here in the West, talking about, the sort of the axis of upheaval, or all these ways in which we try to lump groupings and say there's now an alliance between North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China. Yes, there are some things on which they agree, but the level of mistrust among these groups or among these countries and these groups are also profound. So it would be premature to kind of assume that the world is moving into a completely new direction on that. I think with respect to the foreign policy, the main questions that I have is to what extent some of the policies that the Biden administration put in on the economic policies will continue from a place of kind of more of a thoughtful approach to it. If you listen to Jake Sullivan, who has served as a national security advisor under President Biden. Interestingly, the national security advisor laid out the economic vision for a new economic order on the part of the US. I wonder to what extent that vision will continue. And that was sort of a departure from neoliberalism, kind of to a place of much more domestic focus on economic development, industrial policy, return of industrial policy, kind of the protection of workers, all of that. I'd be interested to know to what extent the Trump team will continue that and what will be the impact of that around the world. So like even something like the IRA or CHIPS Act, all of those policies that were put in place, if they continue or not is a big question mark and will make a big difference for global economy and US's foreign policy writ large. Because that has been sort of on one level, the weakest link, because obviously US is not offering, particularly the Indo-Pacific region, the kind of economic tools that they want, particularly through trade agreements and such. But the Biden team was trying to sort of bridge that gap and offer at least something. I don't know if that will continue or we will see complete sort of rupture on the part of Trump team.
Okay. Yep. So thank you for that. And we've talked now a little bit about trade and security. The one other point that we haven't yet talked about directly is climate. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on where that's going to go and the climate cooperation and the aftermath of the Paris Agreement and the upcoming COP meeting in Baku. So any thoughts about that, what we might see?
And
Sure.
of course, when the Biden administration promoted the three C's with a three-pronged approach towards China, that cooperation piece mostly focused on the climate change and some of the other more benign global issues. And but because Trump called climate change is a China made in China hoax, so I'm not sure we're likely going to see a lot of cooperation on the green energy transition side of things. And also because China is really a leader in producing a lot of the equipments and like EVs and solar panels and car batteries and that China is really taking the lead in a lot of the technology development as well when it comes to green transition, and also have the largest power deposit of windmills and other green energy mix in its overall energy mix. But I just don't see whether the Trump administration will be willing to really work a bit more collaboratively with China on that. But China is not going to just focus on only trading green technology with the US and then selling EV cars to the US, because it's very difficult. And there is a wild market out there, including much of the global south, that are very welcoming the really well-made but cheap electric vehicles that China's made. So I think China will continue to spearhead in promoting the green energy transition technology, and also selling its products in that field, and likely will continue to lead that portfolio. And US, if with the Trump administration with less investment, some of the economic policies Lena just talked about, they discontinue some of those and reduce the incentives, we are going to see China just going to take a further lead in that green transition, in the green economy. Maybe just quickly also on the other points about just the overall foreign policy. Trump, he already famously said his favorite word is tariff. So he's really using tariff as a foreign policy tool and doing international politics kind of through the eyes of a businessman. And he talked about, when it comes to Taiwan, he talked about Taiwan will have to beef up and pay for its protection. Even in the Indo-Pacific, he said he would ask Japan and South Korea to pay more because they're not paying enough for the US protection. And he's very willing and ready to use tariff as a tool to hopefully get what he wants, and rather than focusing on exclusively on security and geopolitics. So I just find it's quite an interesting approach, quite a businessman's approach to foreign policy.
And just following on both of these points, Gia, what do you make of Elon Musk and his influence, potential influence, right? I mean, here you have the
Yes.
United States' largest EV manufacturer, right, with a front seat at the table.
Yeah, and we'll have to see how long this honeymoon period between him and Trump will last, whether it's going to last through that 4 years of Trump administration. So Elon Musk clearly has a close business ties with China. He met President Xi Jinping multiple times, and of course he also had that admiration of powerful men and strong men as a leader. So although I haven't heard that he's going to be put in as say Treasury Secretary or someone who's in charge of trade, and if that's the case, it will be really interesting because there's still a lot of production. Tesla is producing the EVs are still in Shanghai in China. So he seems to have at least not that a very hawkish view on doing business with China. But that's not the case for most other people Trump is likely to be surrounded with. So yeah, I was thinking about that the other day as well, and he may be an outlier on that China side of things.
So quickly, and then we'll shift to
just another perspective on the environmental angle. Right? This is an area that where Southeast Asian leaders may see an opportunity as well. Southeast Asia, of course, is very resource rich, whether it's coal, whether it's palm oil, any number of other natural resources that are not generally seen as part of an energy transition. It's not uncommon to hear from leaders of Southeast Asia accusations that the West is hypocritical in having become rich by developing these resources, but putting caps on Southeast Asia as it is trying to develop as well. And of course, Southeast Asia is well aware of the vulnerabilities, their vulnerabilities to climate change. But again, going back to Jokowi, the imperative of development is the overriding concern. And I can imagine, for example, Prabowo in Indonesia and a number of other leaders looking for an opportunity to loosen some of the constraints on development of these resources, or at least look for more support to transition away from them under Prabowo as a way of, again, supporting development.
Okay. Well, I want to leave some time for questions, so I just want to maybe go to our last two questions, just general thoughts, and you've already spoken on some of these, but I wonder about domestic political implications, if you have more to say about that in terms of democratic backsliding, the sort of the global rise of authoritarianism, how that looks from the perspective of the countries you're familiar with in Asia. You've already spoken about that, and then we can maybe end with some thoughts on implications for Canada. But first, just that question of democratic backsliding. Any further thoughts? Tina, do you want to come in? Okay, sorry.
No, I said I've spoken about it already. So.
Okay. Okay, well, if we've already gotten those issues on the table, then what about this last question, which I think might be in the minds of many of us? What does this mean for Canada? And, Canada, we're looking at elections, we're looking at our own uncertainty. How is Canada going to navigate this? And we can spend a lot of time talking about Canada's relationship to the United States, but what does that relationship mean for how Canada positions itself in relation to Asia, with the Indo-Pacific strategy, with its pre-existing relationships and interests, and the difficulties that we've mentioned?
I can start.
Okay,
I can go.
Go ahead.
I totally agree with Reena when she said with regard to India, that transnational repression and the Canada counting on its the United States and other partners, that's not going to happen now. It's just, that's off the table. But there are a couple of things which have been worrying me now since the since the election of Mr. Trump. And that, first of all, his pro-Hindu agenda. I think that's a really, really problematic. Canadian newspapers did not carry this, but Indian newspapers carried it. Indian media carried this news. And Trump came out with a statement yesterday that he was saying, he said, what happened in Brampton? He says, did you see police beating up that Hindu boy? And it was all over Indian videos, YouTubes. Because the moment I saw that thing, I said, let me see what Indian media is doing and what, Canadian. So Canadian media, on the other hand, so I'll go into the narrative, what's still going on. So I'm really worried that the tension which happened last week in Brampton and in Mississauga, we have never seen that kind of thing in Canada. And that is going to, for me, that's pretty problematic. And so Canada will have to think about how to manage its own diaspora. So that's an issue. It's going to get help. Actually, Hindus are going to get help from Trump because the video which Mr. Trump must have seen, it was prepared by a Hindu group in Canada and sent outside. So he's obviously watching the Indian media rather than anything else. So that for me is a big worry, and I think Canada will have to really think about it. If Canada is thinking about it's going to get any help with the freedom of speech and expression and the support from the Trump administration, absolutely not. So Khalisani people will have to, they'll have to figure it out how to balance the whole freedom of speech expression and the violent imagery which is coming out and all that stuff. That's what's happening. But it also, we have to have, if things are going to get better between Canada and India, this political, what I call it, political war, the narrative war which is going on, that has to stop. Even in the presentation of the news, you see of this, what's happened in Brampton, in India and Canada, two different things. The Canadian perspective is no Hindus were involved, no Sikhs were involved. There was somebody else involved. And they didn't name somebody else. Obviously, somebody else is Indian agents here, if you read under the line. Whereas India, on the other hand, is saying it's only Hindus who got beaten up by the Sikhs, not showing the other way around. So this political narrative is becoming a big problem. And somehow, whether Canada is going to get help from anybody else in terms of stopping an end to the Indian narrative, which I find, it's been really trying very hard to isolate Canada in terms of its narrative, because it perceives that India is more powerful as compared to Canada. So India is more powerful, although Canada is a member of, NATO, G7, G20, but somehow India is more powerful globally than Canada. It also feels that Canada cannot do much damage economically to India. That's the other thing which has happened. And India is also very confident that if there's a battle between India and the other Western powers, the Western powers are going to come on the side of India rather than Canada. And you can see the Spanish visit in India, the Germany collaboration, what's happening in Europe, is all alliances. They have paid a lip service to Canada-India problem, but haven't done. So Canada is being bullied by India. But how does that get stopped? We really have to seriously rethink where we are in relation to now new United States and in relation to what the other European powers are doing. So we are in tough times.
Thanks, Reeta. Maybe I'll give everyone a chance to come in on this last question. Kai, I noticed you wanted to jump in, and then we'll go to Reeta and Jeff.
Express a broader concern on this. As everyone probably knows, Canada is 2 years into an Indo-Pacific strategy. It's a hugely ambitious undertaking. As it describes itself, this is a generational whole of government, whole of society shift. It is, to a large extent, unfamiliar territory for Canada, both for the general public, for the government of Canada, for the private sector. And my concern is, of course, the United States has been, is, and always will be the most important trading partner of Canada. That's just a geographic reality. If the kind of political and economic disruptions that we're concerned about, that Trump has alluded to, actually materialize, I would imagine that most of the attention from the top thinkers, the top actors in the Canadian government and private sector will necessarily be redirected towards the US. And if we're thinking about, for example, Canada's foreign service, it's quite stretched thin as is. If many of the top resources are diverted to managing a very difficult, precarious relationship with the United States, that makes it all the more difficult to actually implement this really ambitious strategy, which, as the strategy itself recognizes, is absolutely critical, not necessarily even for today or next year, but for the next several generations, for Canada's well-being 50, 100 years down the road. That, I think, is a profound problem. And of course, if we continue to face financially difficult times, if the economy continues to struggle and the foreign service sees itself under more budgetary pressure, that only compounds the issue of fewer resources redirected away from priorities articulated in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and an emphasis on addressing short-term issues at the expense of what is really the first well-articulated longer-term strategy in the last several decades in Canada.
Thanks. That's well put, Kai. Veena, just 1 second while we get the audio.
Yeah, I'll come in and I'll be brief because I very much agree with Kai on the issue of bandwidth, whether or not there will be much bandwidth for Canada to do other things if the disruptions begin to happen in our relationship with the US. And I think an additional point to that is last time around, I think there's a belief in Canada that we managed a Trump administration really well. And there will be a temptation to kind of very much go back to that same playbook and essentially recreate what happened in 2016 and sort of that Team Canada approach and so forth. And I think some elements of that obviously worked and do need to be brought back, but I would hope that there would be a lot of new thinking because Trump 2.0 is not going to be the same as the first Trump administration. So our strategies also need to evolve. And I'm worried that given that the personnel in Ottawa are still the same that were there at the first Trump administration, there would be really a bias to go back to what we already know and the strategies and the tactics that were tried. So I hope that that would be avoided and we don't fall into that easy pitfall of just kind of reproducing those playbooks. And that obviously also means that there's opportunity to, even though it will be hard and the temptation to be completely to focus on the US relationship, to continue to do stuff with key partners in the region. It will be harder to engage in with the totality of the Indo-Pacific strategy. I mean, I think Kai mentioned that it's really ambitious. So with fewer resources, more limited bandwidth, there needs to be some serious choices made about which particular partners we're going to engage with and to really do that on a strategic level. So the 2+2 meeting, the defense and foreign policy ministers meeting between South Korea and Ottawa and Canada in Ottawa was a really interesting example of that, right? Like we are now deepening relations with South Korea. Can we continue that even if attention goes now to managing relations with the US? Same thing with the Philippines. We've made some strides. So there are some particular jurisdictions in the Indo-Pacific where we've made good headway. I hope we will sustain that even as we try to navigate the new reality. And then the final point is, I think there will be immediate pressure on this 2% of GDP. We've heard already about that. That's clear. That's a point that has been made to all allies and partners. Taiwan needs to spend 5%. Like there's been these targets thrown out there, and for Canada it's 2%, which I hope that we would do in a strategic way, again, by deepening partnerships with South Korea, with others in the region, not just go back to our NATO partners as we look into expanding our defense procurement or buying submarines or what have you. There's a chance to do so with new partners in Asia. I will stop.
We'll have some time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. Please think of your questions, keep them short and punchy, and I'll come back to you in a moment. So, Gia?
I'll be brief, as I also agree with Kai and Veena that indeed there's going to be limited resources allocated to manage relationship other than this very could be rocky one with the US. But at the same time, Canada would need to maybe, look into the future and long-term perspective, long-term strategy perspective. Of course, US will always be there. We will always be the largest trading partner for Canada, the most consequential relationship for Canada. But this, the second Trump term and who will be the next president, but this American first approach is not likely to fundamentally change, and that's going to affect Canada in a major way. And can we still, with the limited resources that we have, to really continue to build our relationship with with allies, like-minded ones, but also those who are not necessarily all like-minded, but at least with a decent level of shared interest in Asia, many of the Indo-Pacific countries, and not to abandon that side of things. Like, we're often known as the fair weather friend, will come when we need, and then nowhere to be found. And we need to still be on the ground and have that relationship, because this the challenges with the US is not likely to magically just disappear, even say after Trump leaves the office. So that's one point. And the other one, again, I'm totally agree with Rita, is when it comes to China, managing this challenging relationship with China, we will have to think less to depend or rely on our powerful ally, the US, to help maybe us with some of the issues, because there will be less solidarity from this Trump administration, and Canada may be largely left on its own when it comes to dealing with difficulties with China. And there will be pressure still on Canada to be tough on China, but there will be a lot less support and sympathy if problems occur or issues go wrong. But on the other hand, China may actually have incentive with this US-China relationship getting bumpier, may have incentive to, and China has already been doing that and softening its stance with India, trying to recreate a more normal relationship, and around the world. And Canada may see a bit of softening on the Chinese side if China sees benefit in improving that relationship. We're already pretty much at the rock bottom, so hopefully there will be some improvement there. So,
okay, thank you. So there's a lot there. I'm going to, I see your hand up, and I'll come to you in a moment. I want to go online first, just because if we do need to end, there'll be opportunity to approach the panelists. Michael, are you monitoring the chat? Do we have any questions? Okay.
I think it was related to the last point. The guest is asking, how will this change if Poilievre wins the next election?
Okay, so look into your crystal balls, and any thoughts on what might happen with the conservative government?
With regard to India, India is hoping for a conservative government, because its experience with Stephen Harper was pretty good and pretty solid. And so they have also, when I say war, political narrative war, is a war between India and Justin Trudeau. That's how it has been framed. So they are hoping that there will be a government change, and that Stephen Harper days will come back, when there was a very active engagement, realization of that there is something called Khalistan Group, when he apologized for Air India bombing, et cetera, et cetera. So they're hoping for that. So that's India's hope.
Okay, so let's go to the room. Question here, and then after that. Oh, okay, excellent. Yes,
It's great panel, very insightful, the kind of stuff I love listening to. Another person I listened to is an Indian man, Praveen Sawhney. He's a former general and officer in the Indian Army. And I think he speaks to something that Veena mentioned, where he said that, where she said that China and India are strategic rivals and strategic competition. And Praveen Sawhney is characterized as a fundamentally flawed assessment, because in no way are China and India competitors. China is a world power, and India is a hopeful power one day. And actually, with India's problems with Pakistan's borders and integration of China and Pakistan militarily, actually India is not in a space to think of itself as a competitor with China. And if India is powerful enough to bully Canada, and the United States isn't going to help us in that. We have to stop this focus of, oh, let's double down on our relationships with South Korea and the Philippines, who will not be able to offer us any support in dealing with India, and who themselves need our support in dealing with China. Perhaps the one other power that would be able to be a countervailing power in our own situation. So, anyways, that's not so much a question, but I think the key word that Trump said is, it's not about global warming, it's about nuclear warming. So that's going to be at the forefront. There is a real high chance of nuclear war if we go down this entrenched camp way, and perhaps actually Trump's going to cool that down, or at least be cognizant of that.
Okay, thank you. I won't try to summarize that for those of you online. Questions about relative power of India and China, questions about nuclear arms race. Does anyone on the panel want to come in on these points?
No, I totally agree with you. It's not only that there's not the equitable problem, but India has huge problems of equity, inclusion, poverty within India. Women's literacy, for example, women workforce. So India has a lot more issues which China doesn't have. So it's not, so I do agree with Praveen Swami completely. I read that column which you did too. So no, totally agree.
We're getting to time, Phil.
I have one question. We mentioned several times the emergence of different groupings as the rules-based post-war systems and emerges, deteriorates, however we want to describe it, into these multipolar groupings, and there are some that have emerged, a possibility of more. If the underpinning ethos principles of the post-war system was rule of law, the rules-based system, what do you see as the underpinning principles and drivers of these multipolar groups? Is it more personal ties? What is it? What, as opposed to a system of rules, or is it similar?
So what are the differences in the underlying rules of multipolar groups or alliances relative to the rules-based international order?
Principles.
Yeah, underlying principles behind those different models. Thoughts, reactions?
I can tell it's a idea which is in the making, but the idea is not that abandoning the rules-based system, but basically saying that the way global governance is right now, it is not equitable.
The Western,
it's a
Western-based system.
It is not equitable, it's not pluralistic, and it is unrepresentative.
Okay.
So that is one of the biggest fundamental factors. India has been denied a seat in the Security Conference for many years, and China is objection to that. They also want both the major powers of Asia and minor powers of Asia to have what India calls a shared rule in regional decision making. So it's not that there won't be any rules, but it's got to be rules which favor a kind of inclusive representation. So inclusivity rather than exclusivity is the principle, and so it's, as I said, it's an idea in the making. And so I don't know where it's going to go. As Veena said, there's so many differences of opinions there. And not only BRICS, but in this whole group, Southeast Asia, India, China, I don't know whether they're going to go there or not. But, I wanted to say about the BRICS, one of the big things which they agreed upon was a alternative currency, right? And so, of course, it's not going to go anywhere. But India has started a system, it has been there for a while, where it's been allowing people to do trade in national currencies. So that system has been already established. So I think the rules are in the process of making.
Okay, one more question. We'll extend for 4 more minutes. Okay, I'll take 2 questions and then give the panel a last opportunity to react. We will finish promptly at 5:06. Okay, Michael, and then over here.
Yeah. This is another online.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so maybe read that online question.
So it's in regards to Trump's America First approach. regarding migrant labor and Asian immigrants in the US. Do you think this stance on migrants and their work will have detrimental effects on partnerships with the US and Asian states, especially for countries who rely heavily on the export of labor, like the Philippines?
Okay, thank you. And so for those of you who are online, you can read that question. And then another question here. So if you could speak as loudly as possible, so.
I
Mike's.
just have a question for Professor Ostwald and maybe for Professor Reeta, because we talk about the democratic backsliding and Trump as the epitome of the democratic backsliding. But from my experience in Vietnam, during the Biden administration, Vietnam actually like upgrade the relationship with the US to the highest level. And then right now, in the entire political, we have like 2/3 of the political is come from the public security ministry. And basically the ministry that's actually jail journalists, jail activists for the last 4 years. Normally, and there's a very, very normal activity right now in Vietnam. So whether or not, my question is whether or not this democratic backsliding is often come, or is that just the normal return to the Cold War order when the US does not have the power, the hegemonic power anymore compared to other powers?
Okay.
That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. So a question about democratic backsliding, whether it's a unique feature of US administrations or it's a longer trend and with reference to Vietnam. So please feel free to take either of those questions.
I've been talking a lot, so.
Sure, I think that's in some ways there's a very direct answer to that. There's been a lot of concern about democratic backsliding in Southeast Asia long before Trump. It was clear that Trump would even contest the 2020 election. I mean, this occurred under Biden, it occurred prior to Biden. If we go country by country through Southeast Asia, we can maybe identify 1 or 2 countries where the trajectory is not concerning, but in every other country, it is at least minimally concerning. And this is also not even unique to Southeast Asia. This is across the Indo-Pacific. This is worldwide, right? I think this goes far beyond Trump, of course, though Trump compounds concerns about whatever global norms were in place to reinforce and provide incentives for adherence to democratic norms.
And
I think with regard to democratic backsliding, I think I'm going to give you a political science question. Most of the democracies have been flawed. Even if you look at the United States, has not been a perfect democracy. So from that point of view, what is democratic backsliding? Is basically the relative proportion of the freedom of speech and expression, protection of the minority rights, how the dissent is allowed, and the operation of political process, fair and free elections. What is the relative portion? So, most of democracy which have been flourishing over the years have been flourishing because the relative weight of these things was much higher. Now, with regard to the case of Southeast Asia and India, we know that India is one of the exceptional cases where even if it's a flawed democracy, it did operate for a long period of time. And there was a backstep. And with regard to the Southeast Asian states, we know that these were developmental states where authoritarianism was seen as a quick way, basically the most efficient way for economic development. And democracy came much later. So we can't compare, apples and oranges. So with regard to India, it's a very specific aspects with regard to democratic backsliding. And I wouldn't put all the countries in the same package.
Okay, I think we're going to have to draw the discussion to a close. However, I would invite you to stay on after we formally close if you have questions, and we can have informal discussion for a few minutes at the front of the room. Veena, I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get back to you, but thank you for your contributions online, and apologies for the audio. We're in a state of construction here, so the rooms aren't fully up to speed with the latest audio, but thank you for your patience. Thank you to the panelists for a really fantastic, robust discussion. Thank you to Noel and Katie and Hiba in the background who did a great job in the preparation, and Noel and Katie, thank you for managing a difficult AV situation. And thank you all, audience online. Thank you very much for joining us, and thanks to all of you for sharing your afternoon with us. Thank you. Bye-bye to everyone online. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious as to whether other.
Hi, Katie.
Like something they were looking at, have the same kind of feeling.
Thank you.
As that let it.
Thanks, folks.
And it'll benefit us in the long run.